everyone, to our Scholars in the Square lecture this evening. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown, and I am the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. Now, as a reminder, our SITS format unfolds as follows. First, our speaker, Dr. Peter Evans, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then he will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Dr. Tommy Happinut, who is assistant professor of anthropology here at UVic. Tommy is Chachasias from the Hawaiian First Nations, and his research documents the reclamation of knowledge, teachings, culture, language, responsibilities, and identity through his relationship to his family's hereditary territory. Tommy's work is part of a larger story of reconciliation and reclamation to the territory in which the lands, waters, skies, and the natural spiritual worlds are not a place and or object of inquiry. They are non-human knowledge holders and teachers. And so after Peter and Tommy talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a 20-minute open discussion period. So our speaker for this evening is Peter Evans. Peter is a consulting anthropologist and a current community sabbatical fellow at the CSRS. He earned his PhD at the Scott Polar Research Institute, University of Cambridge, studying Inuit Moravian encounters in Northern Labrador. He co-founded Trailmark Systems, and as a part of that work, has worked with Indigenous communities for 20 years on ethnohistorical projects, land use, cultural heritage, and digital archives. He's currently working on a project with the CSRS on Coast Salish myth using an anthropological read of René Girard's mimetic theory. His talk tonight is based on this work. Now, each week, we pause before we begin our lecture to acknowledge the lands that we are meeting on and our positionality on them. And knowing how important it is to go beyond mere rote recitation, I try to tie the topic of the evening to the university's land acknowledgement each week, hopefully making connections between all of our research endeavors and our situatedness on these lands. And getting folks to reflect on how their work, even if on Chinese Buddhism, AI, or religion and pop culture, might contribute to or be impacted by broader dynamics of colonization, land dispossession, and relationality. And tonight's topic is obviously directly related to these topics, and is directly related to Coast Salish lands, exploring questions of encounter between and among Indigenous and non-Indigenous ideas, communities, and individuals. And so, as always, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, Wisapsim, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And so now please join me in welcoming Peter.
Much, Rachel, and I just want to thank the center staff and other fellows for having me the last couple of months. It's been a wonderful experience to be part of an academic setting again, and I want to thank Tommy for agreeing to do this, and I want to thank all of you for coming and for listening to this craziness. So usually I talk off the cuff, and I decided that this subject was so important that I was going to write instead. I thought, you know what, this will actually take up less time too. I don't know if that's going to work, but anyway, we'll see how it goes. So, mimesis and scapegoat in Coast Salish myth. In the book of Leviticus, two brothers, sons of Aaron, are killed by God for mucking around in the sacred, not in a good way, as we say today. To avoid more killing, the Lord sends instructions to Aaron by way of his brother Moses on how they should behave in the holy place on the Day of Atonement, what sacred garments to wear, and how to make sacrifice. He is told to bring 3 animals, a bull for his own household atonement, and 2 goats. The goats are to be assigned their task by lot. That is, it would be nothing personal. One goat would be sacrificed as a sin offering to the Lord, and the other would have the sins of the people projected upon it by the hands of the priest, and it would be driven into the wilderness as a scapegoat. Again, nothing personal. In a text gathered by George Hunt and Franz Boas, entitled The War Against the Sanish, and published as part of his ethnology of the Kwagylth in 1923, a Kwagylth chief named Henkapenkum is on a rampage over the mysterious death of his sister and her family, who, the story tells us, probably died of a mishap on their way back from Victoria. But Henkapenkum's grief will not be assuaged, and he cries out for a substitute, for someone to carry it. He desires the peace of mind that others have, And he believes he can achieve this by projecting his grief and violence onto another. He raises a war party from amongst the warriors of the other new maims or houses. As part of their preparation, the wives of the raiders fill up kelp balls with their breath and weave them into circles, which they must maintain with care and ceremony as long as their husbands are away. Near Saanich, the war party sees a family of Saken people camping on an island, 4 adults and 3 children, asleep beneath the canvas of a sail. One of the warriors says, "Now take care, warriors, do not hesitate to kill, for now we have found our salmon." They stab them through the covering of the canvas. 4 people are murdered, and 1 or possibly 2 children are taken as slaves. The warriors celebrate with each his particular sacred dance. But at home, one of the wives drops her kelp ball and it shatters. Before they can make their escape, a love triangle that had been simmering among the warriors at home bursts out, and one man shoots another. Now there is violence among the raiders too. The murder is reported in the newspapers of the day. The entire colony holds its breath, awaits the Saanich response, but it does not come. Why? But more importantly, what is it about these 2 disparate stories that seemingly binds them together? Many of us will have had the experience sometime in life of being awoken by an idea. Immanuel Kant said that of reading David Hume, that felt as though he had been awoken from a long slumber. In my own case, I pulled over onto a gravel shoulder many years ago, somewhere in the subarctic, to attune my hearing more closely to David Cayley's gentle interview with an elderly Frenchman named René Girard. Cayley piece called The Scapegoat, the thought of René Girard, has been the accidental gateway for many fans of Girard in North America. I knew that right away that what he was saying about humans was analytically powerful. I'd spent my life in universities, and I thought right away, this is one of the most analytically powerful ideas I've ever heard. I felt, and have since heard other people say too, that disparate, unrelated, and half-chewed facts in my mind seem to feel suddenly illuminated. I can't promise you this kind of experience tonight, obviously, unless you're deep into your own bag of gummies or whatever, but I'm grateful to share some of the mutual insights of my work that I've been working on between Coast Salish myth and Girard's mimetic theory that I've been working on for the last couple of months. So first of all, who was René Girard? He was born on Christmas Day, 1923, and died at the age of 91 in 2015 in Stanford, California, where he'd been a greatly beloved teacher in the departments of civilization and French languages for many years. He taught at several other US universities, Johns Hopkins. And I won't say much more about his biography. In fact, I won't say anything at all. But I direct you to this excellent new documentary that came out about 2 years ago called Things Hidden. It's available on YouTube. It's a fantastic piece, and it's full of interviews with Girard over the years as well. Slide. Yes. I mean, what is a lecture without some Simpsons slides? But I mean, really, the Simpsons. If you want to understand mimetic theory and violence and scapegoating, the Simpsons is where you go. So this is mimetic theory in 5 minutes or less. Girard's first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, in 1966, explored the code that he claimed great writers had figured out. Between the desiring subject and the desiring object, there's a third party, a model of whom we are often unaware. Peers, siblings, society at large, a mentor. Before you desire what someone else has, you co-opt their desire. You desire their desire, and you desire their relationship with the object, which may be their existence itself. All desire, Girard has said, is a desire for being. The belief that desire arises unbidden from within a fully autonomous self, or in response to the innate sexiness of an object, is what Girard called the romantic lie. People cling to this romantic idea, despite the overwhelming evidence that we are not the individuals we take ourselves to be. And in fact, we are what Girard called interdividuals. Here's a concept very close to reciprocity. But it's probably as close as he gets. He called this special kind of imitation mimesis. It is just the way we are. It's how we learn, it's how culture spreads, and mimesis gives rise to flourishing human communities, but it has a tendency to devolve into what he called mimetic rivalry. Why? Because people co-opt one another's desires, and their desires fall upon the same objects. They end up wanting the same things, and in the process, they become like one another. Girard is well known for his statement, people do not fight because they are different, they fight because they are the same. This is a radically different way of looking at conflict in one's home, in one's community, in one's history. After Deceit, Desire in the novel, Girard turned his attention to anthropological texts and the consideration of how humans solve the problem of mimetic rivalry. He published Violence in the Sacred 11 years later, and then Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World and The Scapegoat in 1981. At some point, because violence and disunity were their greatest threat, early humans birthed a way to repair the fractures between individuals and restore harmony to their group. They chose a single individual to receive and carry the blame, a substitute, a scapegoat. The scapegoat mechanism, as he called it, he argued was unconscious and random, and its function was innocent of the guilt of the victim. It's written all over the texts of the ancient world, over its myth, in all human societies. The tendency to blame a single person, a victim, is simply everywhere, and we maintain today some sense of its once unconscious functioning. You should ask yourself, is Debbie in HR really to blame? But doesn't it feel good to talk about her? The pacifying effects of such a move on the group and the effects on their consciousness, if some other threat that the scapegoating was intended to address, like a plague, works, then it gives birth to the sacred order. How? Because of the double transference of the mechanism. The choosing of a victim draws the community together and restores order by removing an external threat at the same time. And people will say, well, that person must have been a god of some kind. And now we have what is called a sacred victim. This is the birth of the sacred via the birth of sacrificial violence. The discovery that we can trade the violence of all against all for the violence against a single victim. A little bit of violence in exchange for a lot. Myth, for Girard, is coded sacred violence. And often, the structure of myth obscures the violence and tucks it out of sight so that it can do its job making the cultural order appear dropped from the sky. Just as the scapegoat mechanism was unconscious, many scapegoat texts conceal their origins in violence. When a group of victims are remembered, for instance, as a group of survivors, when a group of victims or as a group of people who suddenly appear on Earth, or when a boy who was expelled from the community is mythologized as someone who unites and saves the community, or when a man is turned into an animal or vice versa, or into stone, and the death that such a transformation would require is concealed. To see beneath these things, we can undertake what Girard called a desacralizing analysis. We peer beneath the myth to see the sacred victim and the process by which a scapegoat becomes a god or a fool, and the stories about him become laws. These are the things that were allegedly, quote, hidden since the foundation of the world. This approach to myth is radically at odds with the current popular and academic approach within legal discourse and anthropology, where myth is treated as transmitted legal order or social fact, accompanied by accounts of past ecological and dramatic phenomena, or true events, or what is sometimes called deep history. These are some of the signposts of mimetic theory and myth that I used while I was studying Coast Salish myth sources. So a community crisis of some kind, mimetic crisis between friends, an outsider, someone different, a stranger, a dupe, an orphan, a slave, and all versus one event, such as an expulsion, an abandonment, or a killing. This is a very large category of Indigenous myth. A resurrected or significantly transformed individual who becomes more than merely human. A killing narrated as a transformation. A sacrificial crisis in which the sacrificial violence can no longer contain the real violence and they become indistinguishable from one another. This is also something you see in a lot of myths. An ambiguous divine figure who is neither good nor evil, but whose often profane activity is used to illustrate right behavior. This is probably the largest category of myth. And then finally, the motif of a bad man. Was really widespread in the myths I looked at as well. So I've been using several important collections. First, the Salish myths from Franz Boas's Sagan, which were edited and annotated by Dorothy Kennedy and Randy Bouchard and published by Talon Books in 2002. The second was a collection of stories, both myths, legends, and oral histories, recorded by Saanich elder Chris Paul, or collected by him, Philip Pelkey, as part of the BC Indian Languages Project around 1971, and translated by Randy Bouchard and Dorothy Kennedy. The third is an unpublished collection of stories gathered by Diogenes in the 1930s among the Saanich and Cowichan. It's unpublished, and actually it was Randy Bouchard and Dorothy Kennedy who found it and rediscovered it in the National Archives, I think in the 1980s. Randy and Dorothy are watching online, so I want to acknowledge that the three most important texts that I used, they were very instrumental in creating, and without their work, I wouldn't have had access to those. At the outset, I expected to find examples of sacred violence in Coast Salish myths, but I anticipated a deeply encoded, barely perceptible violence or scapegoating, not like the fully exposed violence of the Nuliayak or Sedna myth from the circumpolar Arctic, in which a child is drowned by her father, cuts her fingers off, and then they become the sea mammals, and she becomes the goddess and the primary figure in the shamanic hunting complex. It's just so beautifully exposed. I wasn't expecting anything like that. But in fact, the themes of mimetic rivalry, community crisis, scapegoating, sacred violence, and sacrifice were prevalent across the collections. For instance, I found an explicit or inferred scapegoat in approximately 40% of the stories. And this actually excludes the transformer or Hale stories and the divine animal stories as well. So just some examples. Stories of the flood and stories of the transformers, sometimes called Hales, either singularly or as two brothers, are found among all Coast Salish groups. The flood stories describe why a few people lived and everyone else died. They are all against one inverted. The Coast Salish variant encodes the landscape itself with sacred places where the chosen can be safe from the violence, such as the top of Tlawelnach. In the transformer myths, the violence is often punishment for some breached taboo or desire. In Saanich Bay, according to Genesis informants, a man in love with a married woman hid in the long grass and watched her as she bathed. Hails turned them both to stone. Mimesis, see, will get you killed and you will deserve it. Transformer, who's called the Wanderer in some of these stories collected by Boas, has many of the characteristics of a deeply camouflaged sacred victim, but he himself creates others. The Transformer stories establish the relationship between people and animals and identify those animals that are to receive special religious and ethical attention in the sacrificial hunting system. Another group of myths concerns the ancestors to whom the members of an extended family trace their lineage. In the case of the Cowichan, these are sky fallen ancestors. And in the case of the Saanich, these are usually historical legendary figures like Qualaquinthet, the founder of Sartlet, a real ancestor whose life was of mythic proportions. He was a survivor of reciprocal violence in his home village. He wanders in the woods until arriving at the home of the future Sartlet village. And he overcomes his past by prayer and observation and training. This genre of stories, historical legendary stories, described a historical person or a series of events, but return to their mythic origins. They incorporate scapegoat violence. An example of this is the oral history about the South Saanich Treaty, which incorporates the story of the killing of a boy by the English as a foundational event that draws the community together. I would argue that it's the incorporation of this violent event and its transformative power that transforms the treaty event into a sacred happening and not its legal character. So there's many other motifs predicted by the mimetic theory across Coast Salish myth. were the primary myths, the founding myths, and the cosmological legends that come from them, such as Raven's Tales of the World. Raven's Tales, Minx Tales are echoed across the Coast Salish world with modest variations. So some other recurring motifs of mimesis include stories of rivalry between peers or leaders, mimetic escalation between family and friends, collective violence or expulsion framed as necessary, stories of difficult people who are expelled by the community, stories of bad men or powerful figures who are killed by a collective, monsters who are blamed for danger and targeted by the community, specific murders that are recalled as a cultural foundation, killing of a boy that can stabilize the group decisions and movement, resurrections, returns from death, or other transformations. Oh, that's the slide I was supposed to be on. You get the picture. I'm very appreciative of the Center for having me here for the last few months, where I've been able to begin what I hope will grow into a longer engagement with mimetic theory and Indigenous myth and history. The outcome might be a series of articles or a monograph, I'm not sure yet, or it might just be a series of sleepless nights, thinking all of this over. I want to conclude by mentioning a few disjointed things that I've been mulling over for some time, which have come out of this engagement, but doesn't really have a home within it yet. The first is that I think our understanding of Indigenous myth is long overdue for a reassessment. The current approaches, which are the sort of Mausian, Durkheimian approaches that view myth as social fact, they bind us ultimately to this true-false dichotomy that I think is sort of beneath the appreciation of myth and what it really is. Second, the corpus of stories I'm working with is similar to the ones that are being used by scholars and practitioners who are attempting to reinvigorate Indigenous laws, which is a project that I'm very sympathetic with. I've read quite a number of reports of the Relaw Project and others over the years, and some of its major literature. And I want to offer a word of gentle caution that comes from this Girardian analysis. I don't think Indigenous laws can be separated from the Indigenous sacred. I think we can all agree on that. But the sacred cannot be separated from its origins in sacred violence. If you overlook this connection, you may end up enshrining scapegoat violence within law. What we might do instead is to rededicate ourselves to eradicating the residues of scapegoating within our mutually shared present system, which have often targeted Indigenous people. Secondly, Girard is having a hot minute because we live in a frantically mimetic and violent times. He once said that Shakespeare was a theater of envy, but he didn't even hang out on Facebook. He didn't really live, that's a mimetic, that's a theater of envy. We live in a world of a million mimetic machines. They ramp up our rivalries and our envy every day. But for all that, I don't think there has ever been, and I'm saying this from my professional background now, of several decades, a machine quite as efficient at producing mimetic rivalry and violence as the Indian Act and its related policies. The entire system, which Robert Payne called welfare colonialism, forces people to imitate one another in dangerous ways, to compete over a small pool of identical resources, the same houses, a small number of identical jobs, and for carefully curated sets of possible career paths, and on and on and on and on. Do I have 2 minutes?
You have 1 minute.
1 minute? Perfect. One of the insights that renewing my understanding of myth through the mimetic theory has generated is a brand new appreciation for how Coast Salish culture recognized and girded itself against the dangers of mimetic doubling and rivalry. Societies mitigate mimetic rivalry and violence through what Girard called differentiation, or social structures that limit or contain the possibility of dangerous rivalry between people. From that perspective, the class, rank, moiety systems of the Pacific Northwest look very different. In Coast Salish culture, a highly nuanced message about imitation and learning places an emphasis on imitation of mentors for teaching reasons, while cautioning against dangerous imitation and rivalry. Over many years of interviewing Saanich elders and other informants, I've learned about the emphasis placed upon individual roles within the extended family and community. People often stress how good it makes young people feel to understand that the world holds a place for them. But mimetic theory has helped me appreciate this from a new perspective. A community of grave diggers will soon come to envy and rivalry. But if there is only one, he has no one to compete with. If there are two, the rivalry can be more easily contained between teacher and student. This system of differentiation may have reached into other aspects of Salish life, such as the way that households and villages tended to specialize in harvesting. If everyone follows the same round, everyone will be competing for everything else. This danger threatens all of us now, in our time, but the Coast Salish world offers us wisdom and one possible solution. Thank you very much.
So now Tommy and Peter will get to chat.
Are we in the right position?
You're fine.
Are we good?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah. Awkward, but not
No,
too
it's
awkward.
it is like a talk show.
Yeah. A few things stood out for me, and I guess the first thing I'd like to hear you from it, and you somewhat addressed this just now, as this is what are your thoughts on Girard's understanding of myth, right? Like, because anthropologically, sort of traditionally, myth is seen in a very particular way, and one that has been used, I think, to help oppress Indigenous knowledge in a particular way. And so, do you think Girard was moving beyond that in his definition of myth?
Can you say a little bit more about the use of myth or things that have been interpretations of myth that have suppressed Indigenous knowledge? Because I'm interested in that.
Yeah. So myth in the sense of that's mythological, and so moving it into the sense of like maybe folklore, maybe not, not scientific in the way that we sort of. But from my perspective as a young person, I'd be like, you call myth, I'd call stories and history, and that's way.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's you might think, at first glance that that's what's coming out of Girard, and I think it's actually the opposite. That you get this new appreciation for what myth is, but also how all human societies work, because of this mechanism and this function of myth that operates everywhere and continues to operate today. The film Wicked is a Girardian reading, a Girardian desacralization of a classic American myth, where we, the audience, are revealed to have been on the side of the killers this whole time, but there was nothing wicked about the Wicked Witch at all. That's the myth on which American society was grounded. The other amazing thing about the Girardian view of myth is that in Girard's account of myth, you really can see how Christianity is favorably related to Indigenous and other non-Christian religions, because they all have the same structure, right? It's the same structure of the sacred violence and the resurrected God. And for other interpretations of myth, that was a criticism of Christianity, and Girard says, like, well, of course, that's what a god is. It's a god is a resurrected victim in every single myth, So, for instance, like the thing about the myth about the Douglas Treaty, or the story about the Douglas Treaty, right, is that I've heard that story from Indigenous people for many years, and then the Indigenous teller will walk away, and a non-Aboriginal scholar might say to me, there was no boy who was killed, right? That historical event didn't happen, right? But the Girardian analysis says there absolutely, in all human history, are people who were killed to establish the sacred, right? And the incorporation of that killing into that story grounds that event and that treaty in the realm of the sacred, where it becomes a sacred thing.
I'm going to get you guys to talk just a little louder.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sorry. Big house voice. Yeah.
I'm very interested in this idea of sacrificial violence as well, because again, so not Coast Salish, neighbors, but not Coast Salish. And so my sort of questions that I'm framing are coming more from the Chala context and background, but I think are relatable. And so this idea of sacrificial violence, when I think about Nchana stories, and we've spoken a little bit about this, I see sacrificial violence layered in so many of the stories that I know. Raven stories, for example, come right to my mind in terms of, the other animals who have made sacrifices on behalf of humans.
Yes.
To provide us with things that we need, because there's this great moment in a film called In the Light of Reverence, and it's from 2001, and it's highlighting the Winnemem-Wintu Nation, who are in California around what's known as Shasta Lake, and their creation story talks about how the creator gathered all these beings and they got to choose what they were going to be moving forward. So there's like transformation stories.
Yeah.
And then a little spirit came up and said, I want to be human, went, woo, ran down the hill, like, ah, right? And so the creator called back others and said, you're going to have to help this being, because look at them, they're running down the hill, wild and free. And so when I'm thinking about Indigenous stories on the island and on the coast, there's always someone who's helping or willing to take on sort of the sacrificial violence onto themselves in order to benefit others.
Yes.
Right. So an individual taking on a sacrifice to benefit the community. Deer in our stories, deer, burned himself to get fire.
Yes.
Or Raven, transforming himself into different things and eventually getting eaten by the chief who held the son, by his daughter to be then birthed into the family and things like that. And so, I find it really interesting how today I'm coming to a point. I find it really interesting how today we've sort of backed away from violence, and when I think I'm hearing that you're saying within the Coast Salish literature you were looking at, and certainly in Nchana, violence is very apparent in the stories.
Yeah.
And how might you account for that shift?
Well, so your question about sacrifice is really important. In fact, it was like there was a trajectory in Girard's life from identifying one kind of sacrifice to realizing that there was another kind of sacrifice too, right? Because the first form of sacrifice is the substitutionary logic of offering something in place for the violence against many, right? But then it was actually in conversation with a theologian friend of his, where he realized that there was another reading of sacrifice, which is the self-sacrifice, right? So I really it should have come across, and it didn't, because I think maybe I didn't get to it, but I believe that these stories are intended to, we talk about the relationship between animals and people, right? And as family, that's how a lot of Indigenous people describe them, right? That these stories tell the transition from human to animal violence, and how animals took that on themselves for humans in place of humans, and thus became their sacred animals and also their relations. So I think you're totally right. I think that's what myth establishes. And the myths they're incredibly violent. There's just no, they're violent, they're profane, they're fun. Like there's no way around it. Like they're awesome, right? Like the Nuu-chah-nulth myth about Kwatia, who he wants to marry the 2 dolphin sisters. And then he does, but his penis breaks off and he throws it away, right? Like you read these to a child, they're excellent.
I read some of these to my son. Yeah. And I mean, even quite, yeah, right. He's birthed out of violence and grief.
Yes.
Right. And so, if you don't know quite yet, he was born out of snot. And
that's right. Yeah.
Through his mother's grief, at a loss.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
the snot, the snot reminds me that there's a lot of contagious elements in myth. And Girard says his claim is that the contagious elements like blood, snot, that they're to represent, or that they are linked to the contagious nature of violence itself, and especially blood, because blood is directly linked to the spread of violence between people in a mimetic crisis that devolves into a struggle of all against all.
Well, okay. Interestingly too, I think, right, like if Kwatyat's mother was in grief, right, and so she's feeling that grief, and then he's born from her snot, sort of I don't know. Everyone here has probably sneezed and felt how violent that is.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but her grief is he is the resurrection of something that
right.
she was potentially grieving.
Yes. Yeah. There's a sacred victim there.
Yeah.
For sure. You can in that. And Boaz in the Sagan translation that René Girard and Dorothy Kennedy did, they included this essay by Boaz at the back, which is an analysis of all of the myths and the Sagan, but also other Indigenous myths, and that motif of the person born from the snot of their mother occurs in other areas as well. Like it's quite a widespread motif in myth. Yeah, I agree with you. It has. I think it. It's a pretty amazing story.
Yeah, I'm finding I align a little bit. Which is interesting for me. How are we for time?
You can ask maybe one more.
Okay. No. Does Girard make space for the non-human and sort of? So I know, like, you talked about the God in place, but would Girard would the questions you're asking? How does place as another being or as a character fit into?
That's a really good question, and I was aware that even as like a cultural geographer that I was leaving it to the side, but when I got to looking at all the transformation stories or the transformer stories, I was like, oh shit, you can only ignore this for so long, right? And ultimately understanding sacred has to involve understanding how it establishes a container, and that ultimately that where people can be safe from danger. That's why I included that line from the Great Litany at the bottom. It's kind of like the heart of the sacred. So there's always a spatial element to it, to the sacred. So maybe that'll be the next thing I'll look at. Super important.
I asked because I'm reminded of a few stories of times in which place has come and saved from potential sacrificial violence, when that violence may not have been, or when place sees it as, or creator sees it as not
That's right, or safe, like
Or
the top
safe,
of Mount Cloelna, during all of the places to which people seek refuge in the flood are all sacred because they're places where you can shelter from catastrophe or violence. Yeah. Very cool. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Open up to a broader conversation now. No, you can stay right there because you can be a part of the conversation. All right, we got a couple here. So yeah, I'll go start with you.
Thanks so much, Peter. This was amazing. I learned so much. Thank you. I'm really interested in Girard, and I sometimes actually use Cynthia Haven's biography in teaching.
Oh, it's fantastic.
And religion. So it's a wonderful book, and I find it very moving. It's a very, very moving book. It's funny you talk about Girard, and this is the basis for my question. Kind of having a moment a few months ago. I mean, there was an op-ed piece in the Globe and Mail that talked about Girard. And I was thinking, whoa, Girard is now so in that he's in the Globe and Mail. And so my question is there anything about this current, profusion of interest in Girard in, a political and cultural moment, which seems to be kind of replete with almost kind of too obvious applications of Girard? Is there anything about his rise to popularity in this moment and some of the ideological associations? I'll just kind of be cryptic about that, but some of the ideological associations that sometimes get associated, so conservative ideological associations and maybe appropriations readings that are part of that upsurge in Girard interest. I mean, maybe some of it has to do with the fact that he became much more ardently Christian later in life, and so I guess my question being, is there anything about that upsurge in interest in this moment and some of its ideological associations and applications, and B, his own ardent Christian posture, increasingly so in his life? Is there anything about all of that that does or should give us pause in how we read and apply Girard on mimetic theory?
Absolutely not. I think just the opposite. I think if you read Girard, Girard himself will answer that question as to why not. But you will also, he's the opposite of an ideologue. He's totally called himself a political atheist. But within his thinking, you can come to see how we generate violence against one another through scapegoating, and how slippery our categories of good and bad are, and how we generate people to fit into those categories, and then historically how just radically extreme our society has become as we slip further and further away from any avenue that can take us to nonviolence. And one of the reasons that he's having a moment is because of course there's a bunch of students, but not students of his, but admirers who have taken up certain of his ideas, like Peter Thiel mostly. And Peter Thiel has funded publication of some of Girard's work. J.D. Vance claims to be a fan of Girard. So there are left-wing Girardians, there are right-wing Girardians, and I think in the middle there are the actual Girardians who want nothing to do with any of that. And I would include myself in that.
That was a really compelling response. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay. I'd like to try and get your take on the link between mimetic violence and poverty. In the Northern class that we're taking right now, law religion times, we start with the Code of Hammurabi from 2112 BCE, which has the first written record of law, so we can actually know what they are. And one of the things it guarantees is the protection of the poor from the rich. Idealized, but going into mimetic violence and what you're saying about wanting to imitate others, which I think one of maybe the contributing factors, let's say, to poverty. And to go into the religious aspect, when a sacred victim is taken, is it taken from the rich or from the poor, the powerful or the weak? And so I just like to get your thoughts on that.
Right. What year is that code?
378. Oh,
Okay.
sorry. The Code of Hammurabi.
Yeah.
2112 BCE.
Okay, cool.
So that's how far back this poverty thing goes.
Yeah. That's great. So historically, and Girard believed that the scapegoat mechanism explains the movement from mammals to humans, right? But that it's the birth of symbolic language and the birth of human, but it persists amongst us. It's always been our mechanism. But that it has a history too, in the sense of like that Marshall Solins meant a history and culture, that the scapegoat mechanism functions just fine. Like you can keep your society going by choosing a sacred victim every once in a while, and then you can do a sacrifice. But then Christianity comes along like a bull in a china shop and just destroys it, right? And that for Girard, that's the most destructive thing that Christianity does, is to destroy the unconscious belief in the scapegoat mechanism. So, and what that does is that it reveals to people, but it's not just Christianity, it's other religions, right? That reveals to people that the scapegoats have essentially been chosen at random, but that they've tended to be innocent. And they've been the poor, they've been women, they've been children, they've been disabled people, they've been people who are weak, people who are on the outside, people who are strangers. And that's why religion is so disruptive. And its failure to deliver on its promise, right, is really how it has failed us. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that if you look into what Girard says about the scapegoat mechanism and why it no longer works, and why, because it no longer works, we just scapegoat each other all day long, because nothing will unite us now. Donald Trump cannot unite us. We cannot agree as a society that is a bad thing, right? Whereas our ancestors would have just gone, oh, bad guy, and then they would have gone on dancing, right? So, yeah.
I was wondering, I'm really interested in Zoroastrianism, and one of the key revelations in Zoroastrianism is this idea that the old gods before the worship of the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda are built off of violence. They're sort of birthed by violence in the same way that you're saying the sacred is sort of built off of sacred violence. So I'm wondering, does Girard have an explanation for these counter movements that suggest gods entirely devoid of violence and practices devoid of violence? And then also connected to that, would he see the death of an old tradition as also a sacrifice? Like, can you scapegoat an idea related to the non-human question?
You can absolutely scapegoat an idea. You can scapegoat dead people. You can scapegoat historical figures, right? We do it all the time. Violence and the sacred deals with subjects just like that. That's a pattern that you also find in Greek mythology between the old gods and the Olympians. And he talks about that. Girard doesn't deal with he deals mostly with Judeo-Christian religious myth, right? But he did write a book because he was always very receptive to criticism, and his friends would go, René, you really should and he would go, okay. And he did write a book on scapegoat theory and the Brahmins, which I've listened to, and it was quite good. But that's an area where people have said, oh, we need to, and that's essentially why this needs to be looked at, this needs to be applied everywhere so that we can see whether this is really valid or true or not. So thank you for that question. I'm glad to learn about that.
That leads a little bit into that question that I'm sitting here with, which is why Coast Salish myth? Why aren't you just telling us about Girard and your thoughts on Girard? And so why grounding it in Coast Salish myth?
Because Coast Salish myth is awesome. Yeah, but I also think that also because it's partly my job, but also the materials to work with themselves are so rich. The materials from the BC Indian Languages Project are so wonderful. These stories that were collected by Chris Paul. Chris Paul was an elder from Sartlip, and he was a very devout Catholic, and he was also an excellent ethnographer. And Randy Bouchard and Dorothy Kennedy, when they had this BC Indian Languages Project, they gave Chris a tape recorder, and he recorded his own stories, but he also recorded stories of other elders. I think because he was such a knowledgeable elder, and because he was a Christian, he understands exactly what's happening in these stories. Like the violence is fully on display. You can see the whole bones of the myths and the stories are shown there. And I think actually when I was reading it, I was like, oh, there's nothing unconscious here about this going on. This is the work of a very perceptive storyteller, and but also for like personal reasons, because I've been because of the work I've been doing for many years, and because of how I started when I was living in a community in Northern Labrador, the question of violence has always been really, really close to my heart. And I think that violence is something that we need to look more honestly and also gently at.
Yeah.
Following off of that, and thanks by the way for everything. This has been super cool. Do you think that there's like a potential within throwing, let's say, Coast Salish myth at Girard or Girard at Coast Salish myth? You can actually see like a bit of an inversion of this kind of sacrifice as the big thing, or like violence as the big thing. Like, so let's just say, and folks in this room can totally debate me afterwards. Let's say death gets seen in this Judeo-Christian kind of worldview as like a failing in the eyes of God, right? Like we're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. We're now mortal. We're covered in this horrible flesh that will become decrepit and pass. Maybe in that, like, then the violence becomes something sacred, because violence is something that we're like meant to be terrified of. Whereas like in the Coast Salish, maybe like it kind of, how can I say this, horizontalizes sacred. Like sacred's every day. It's in everything, because death is just like, life can't exist without death, and death can't exist without life. Like maybe the Coast Salish turn like, because you mentioned how like kind of all over the place death was and violence. Maybe that's just an exception, accepting that life's a cycle. Whereas like, the religious folks can debate me later. The Christian perspective being more evental, like death, and then we just get to go on with it or something like that. Do you think there's that possibility for an inversion?
I think, I agree with Girard that the Christian, the Christian sacred is really similar to every other sacred, that there's a sacred victim, and that the sacred victim reveals something and then establishes a sacred order. And and thank you for asking the question, because I think it gives me like an opportunity to clarify something too. I think the whole point of what I'm seeing is that laws and culture and ideas that we have about things like, let's call them perceptions of an Indigenous world, or any world that's more like social contract theory, is all downstream of an originary violence that people have to contain. And they contain that through the birth of the sacred. And then all of these things grow out of the sacred. And the sacred comes first, and everything flows from it.
So that sacred requires renewal.
And it's, I think that in these myths, it's quite clear that people fear death, just like everyone. Yeah. And that the sacred is not everywhere. It's not everywhere because there has to be the profane and the unsacred to have the sacred, although that's kind of like that's more probably like a Levi-Straussian kind of approach. But I think Girard agrees with that. But the reason that the sacred is so widespread in the myth of the myth and stories of a hunting society is that unlike an agricultural society or another society where sacrifice takes place in very specific places, right? The whole relationship with animals, which are sacred because they're related to you, takes place everywhere. So every one of those encounters with an animal is an opportunity for sacrifice, and those animals are sacrificing themselves for your family. And every animal, that's why every animal is a type of sacrifice. The sacrifice is blended right into the act of hunting. Yeah.
Tommy, did you have something you were going to add?
Yeah, this has me thinking back to sort of my last question about land and and we've spoken about this previously, this idea that for, again, I'll say Nuu-chah-nulth because I don't want to generalize, even though I'm kind of general. For Nuu-chah-nulth people, right, we exist in a place on the west coast of Vancouver Island where we have potential allies or enemies behind us on the other side of the mountain. And we have a ocean that is full of violence. And so we have teachings and laws about how to interact with humans, but also the natural world. Yeah. Because we're surrounded by violence. And so and somewhat to what you were, I think, talking about as well, is this for my people, our stories are violent because we live in a place where we are always engaging potentially, there's always potential violence that we're going to be engaging in. And so our stories have violence in them, right? We sort of started PG. Right. We don't have G-rated stories because as our children are growing up, they need to be made aware that when you go into the forest at night, the stories of the wild woman of the woods or are engaged, right? And so the violence we tell in myth and story is actually also knowledge and law to help sort of protect us as we move through our place. But, and again, like yourself, I don't have a strong, correct me if I'm wrong, people who are have a stronger understanding of Christianity. Our relationship to place is very much embedded in the everyday. And so, we're not just aware of the violence of other people. We're mindful of the violence of our other relations that may include, that tree root or, whaling or a multitude of other engagements and relationships that we have.
I think that's a really important observation you've made. And I think maybe one of the practical applications of looking at myth is to recall that violence is everywhere, and that the purpose of culture is trying to contain violence, to find places where one can be safe from violence because those places become sacred. But and just one last sentence there, that Girard, he's referred to the myth of good violence and the myth of bad violence. And that's the stories that we tell ourselves, that the other people are the violent ones and we're the good ones. And that's something that myth can do as well.
One more thought for you. Yeah. Do you see, sorry. Given the way in which we can put information out there now, how do you see a difference between sort of localized stories that are at a local level and now, we have stuff at global level where everyone knows what's going on in America because it's pushed out there.
Right.
Versus not everyone knows, the story of some of the stories that you highlighted.
Yeah. I think you and I were talking about this with regard to, there was a scapegoating incident on the BC coast not too long ago. And I said, when that person had been driven out of Haida Gwaii and their family was kind of, followed as they drove down the coast, and businesses were said, you can't sell gas to these people, and you can't. And I said, that's an example of that's an example of scapegoat justice. But some people had said, well, no, that's community justice. And I think that's really problematic. And you'd said, and that only is happening now, or it's happening differently because of technology, right? Like,
that family
that's
right.
right.
ended up somewhere and started fresh.
And eventually had to have faced a different kind of reconciliation. Yeah. She's going to shut us down.
I have to, unfortunately. Thank you for this conversation. Next week, same time, same place, we have Youssef Ben-Zouin giving a presentation on Muslim masculinities in Quebec. So please join us next week for that. Thanks all. Have a good evening.
Thanks very much.